Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's class, Stippling Flowers in Artist Loft Illustration Pens. I'm your instructor, Adrienne Hodge, and tonight's class is a standalone class, but it is a bit of a continuation from last week's class where we use the same reference photos to do some value studies using Artist Loft graphite pencils that can be found at Michael's stores. And so, yeah, tonight's class, we're going to be exploring some pen and ink techniques, specifically one pen and ink technique of stippling, which is just one shading technique that you can use when you're drawing with pens or really any material. And we'll talk more about that in just a bit. But before the class starts, I wanted to just preview the class that we have coming up next week. And I just realized it is just right over there. I'm going to grab it real quick. So next week's class, we're going to be working with Artist Loft gouache to do this fun little monochromatic study. And the full name of the class is escaping me at the moment, but Rich has the link to sign up for upcoming classes with Michael's, and you can sign up for that class. I believe it's something to do with blending and layering gouache. I think I titled it Gouache 101, something like that. Anyway, that's next week's class, and I'm excited about that one. And that will be my last class for March. And then I'll be back in April with some fun classes on drawing drapery and another flower study. Flowers are such a good default subject. Okay, I'm going to switch to our my tabletop view here, and then we'll go over supplies and get started. Don't forget to tag your work with the hashtags Make It With Michaels or Michaels Classes wherever you share your work online. And you can find me by searching my link tree. It's just linktree/Adrienne Hodge. Here's some of my artwork on my business cards. I've got a number of in-person classes that I teach here in the Austin area, both at my studio and at the Contemporary Austin Art School at Laguna Gloria. And then I do these classes for Michael's, but I also do some other online classes independently. So you can check all that out or check out my artwork, maybe buy a print of some of my art. I do private lessons. So all that can be found by going to my link tree. Or if you just want to subscribe to my newsletter so that you can see what other stuff I have going on and reminders about these classes. Okay, so tonight's class, we are using Artist Loft supplies. I've got the Artist Loft illustration pad here, the illustration paper, and then some Artist Loft illustration pens. And definitely want to have your sketchbook or some sketching paper, some scratch paper nearby. We're not going to go too much in depth on just well, I mean, obviously we're going to talk about drawing the flowers, but I'll do a quick review on how to get started drawing these flowers. But if you just want some more in-depth look at these reference images that I provided, check out last week's class on these value studies using Artist Loft graphite. Okay, so I am going to pull up our reference photos here. So those were provided in a PDF document for you. And let me just get those on the screen real quick. Okay, so I provided these reference images of roses and Caspedia flowers. And we'll be using the same reference image, one of them from last week, and then the one that we did not use last week will be our second one here. So those are the images. I'm going to probably have mine off screen while I'm drawing, but still handy. But I'll refer to them as we go along here. You should have a copy of that so you can have it on your screen as we go. Okay, so let's talk about the pen and ink shading techniques first. So we're not going to go in depth to all of the shading techniques. We're going to be focusing on stippling tonight, which is the one where we use dots. And I'm just going to find my little page from last week where we talked about the value scale using graphite. Or actually, I don't need that because it's not super handy. I'm just going to use a piece of paper in my sketchbook. So just grab a piece of scratch paper and we'll make a new value scale here. And we'll test out these pens and see what kind of marks we can make with all these different pens. If this is your first time using the illustration pens, they have little numbers on them that tell you the thickness of the nib. So for example, this is the 0.8, so it's got a very 0.8, and it's got a very fat nib, so we can just start to make some dots with it and see how fat those dots will be. Maybe make a few lines with it and just notice how thick your nib is on that 0.8. And then this is the 0.5. So it's going to be slightly smaller. So the dots will be a little bit smaller. The lines will be a little bit thinner. And also the amount of pressure that you put on the pen will change the thickness and the thinness of the lines that you have. So I'm just doing all the different shading techniques here, just a little bit of them. So it's stippling, hatching, cross hatching, and scribbling. So I'm just doing a little bit of that with all of these different nibs just to see the difference in our nib sizes. This is our 0.3. So getting skinnier here. The dots are going to be smaller. The lines are going to be a little thinner. And when I let up on my pressure, I can make them even thinner. Or if I press down a little harder, you never want to press down too hard because that'll mess up the nib of your pen. And then this is the 0.1. So a lot thinner than those other ones. Can get much fainter marks and lines and dots and scribbles to happen. So my hatching, my cross hatching, my stippling, and my scribbling are all going to be a little fainter. So this is what we're going to use to get these really faint faded dots to happen. Let's see, I've got a whole bin of pens here, so I'm just making sure I've done a little practice with all of the options of sizes in that set. Oh, and then we also have a 005. So it's a 0.05. So that's gonna be even smaller than that 0.1 and even fainter. So you might also use this one for those lightest marks. And then we also have a 0.03. So this is actually somewhere in between, or no, it's even smaller than the 0.05. And this one, it looks like somebody was, I share these with my in-person students a lot, and it looks like somebody maybe was a little too rough with this one and the nib got kind of smashed inside of the pen. So you definitely have to be careful with these smaller nibs. And I can see that the lighter ones are maybe not showing up on the Zoom quite as much, but that's good because we need this full range of value. So let's make our full value scale here. So we're going to take whichever pen you want. I'm using the heaviest one, so it'll show up nice and bold here. And we're just going to make our stippling value scale. And this is the one that I often joke whenever I'm practicing these value scales with a student group for the first time. I always spend a good amount of time trying to finish the hatching, cross hatching, and scribbling value scales. But when we get to the stippling one, I always make the joke, you can finish this one later if you're having a hard time sleeping, because it will take a long time. So we'll see if how far we can get here with it, but I definitely want us to have a full understanding of how to create a full value scale with stippling. So first, we're going to write 0 on one end and 10 on the other. So our 0 represents our absolute white or our blank paper. And then our 10 represents our absolute black. So what we're looking for is dots, and pardon my left-handedness, I might be covering up what I'm doing as I'm doing it, but I'll move my hand. What we're doing is, try to go from a different direction. We're stacking these dots, and it's better to use, the thicker the nib that you use, the 0.8 is definitely going to get you a fatter dot than the 0.03. So it'll help us get to that absolute black somewhat faster, although there's nothing fast about stippling. It is the slowest. It takes the most patience of all of the shading techniques. Cross-hatching and scribbling are definitely a lot faster and will fill in an area way more quickly than stippling, but stippling is the easiest one to use because it is just one dot at a time, and we're just building up these dots until we get to a solid black. So all of these dots that you see over here in my, maybe not right here, I might have cheated a little bit and not used stippling on this solid black leaf, but definitely right here, this took a lot of patience building up until I got to a solid black right here. And there's even a little bit of blank paper peeking through in some spots that I'm kind of covering up now. So what we're looking for is layering all these dots until we get to a solid black. And there's just a different effect that happens when you do this. So students often ask, why do this when you could just take your pen and do some hatching or cross hatching or maybe some scribbling, or just color it in until you get to a solid black. And you can, I mean, I kind of did do it right there, but it has a different effect. It definitely helps gradually blend out from dark to light when you do the solid black with the stippling and then let it fade out to the lighter values. So you can see right there how I kind of have or not kind of, I have a 10, I have a 9 right here, just a little bit of paper peeking through. And then it jumps from maybe an 8 or a 7 on the value scale to disappearing and being more of a 2 or a 3 on the value scale right there, and then to 0 and the blank paper. So let's jump on our value scale a little bit here and start to spread these dots out. And you could switch to a smaller nib. Let's jump to the middle here. So I'm going to use the 0.3 nib. Where'd that one go? Right there. I'm going to use my 0.3 nib to get a mid-tone to happen. So that means there's an evenly spaced amount of dots, and you want to be careful not to go too fast because you can end up getting these little slash marks like this, and that can definitely take away from the visual effect of stippling. I'm basically just trying to find something medium in my application of my stippling here, something that's in the middle of nothing and absolute black. So that's going to take some time as well. And then if we move to the lighter part of the value scale, we can just keep spacing out these dots, and then we can jump to our 0.1, 0.05, 0.03, etc., those fainter pens, and try to get it to disappear. And when we get to our 1 and our 2 on the value scale, we want it to be, oops, that was the wrong name. I was looking for the 0.03. We want it to be just barely there. So we're looking for something in between barely there and the mid-tone for the lighter part of the value scale. And I just want to develop that so we can see that gradual shift start to happen. So this can be achieved through spacing your dots out, using less pressure on your pen, or both. And then to increase the value, we're just spacing them closer together, using a little more pressure without pressing down too hard on that nib, and then making them overlap so that they start to have the effect of a shadow. And y'all are probably seeing why I say if you're having trouble sleeping, you can finish this stippling value scale later, because this definitely takes some time to fill in. But as long as you have this, let's get at least our solid 10 to happen here. So no paper peeking through, and at least one little sliver of this long skinny rectangle. And I just love stippling. I think it is so elegant. It's so beautiful and easy for anyone to do. It's a good confidence builder, but the downside is the amount of patience that we need to use while using stippling, and the pressure that we're putting on it. So patience and pressure. Okay, so I just wanted to get at least that solid black to happen to encourage you to do the same. Oops. And if you get a little accidental slash mark in there, you can always be a little more precise and try to cover it up with those concentrated dots. Okay. So that's what we're aiming for here, is this representation of the full value scale. And we can see that in my drawing right here, as I pointed out already. I've got a solid 10 in a lot of places near the edge of this rose and the Caspedia flowers here. And then there's a lot of lighter values in midtone. So while it may seem like, wow, this is going to take a really long time to execute, there's a couple of different tricks that I used with these studies to make it not take so much time. And that is, we're drawing them smaller. And if you were with us last week for the graphite class, it was the same idea. We're drawing them smaller inside of a little box. We're going to make a little frame using a Post-it note or maybe a business card, whatever you have that's square nearby that you can trace. And then the reference images that I provided are very strategic in that they have really strong value. They have really strong, obvious areas of dark and then a lot of light. So there's a lot of blank paper in these images, and that's why I wanted to use this photo in particular, because there's a lot more white and light areas than there is dark. Mostly the dark is just in the background, and that's going to help push forward that rose. Okay, so let's do some practice drawing real quick here, and then we'll get started on our final studies. And gonna flip to a blank page in my sketchbook and actually give me one moment to find the practice drawings from last week because one of them I already did and I can just draw over my other drawing. I meant to bookmark it with a post-it and I did not do that. Are there any questions, Rich, that I could maybe answer while I'm searching for this?
No questions yet, but a little bit of questioning about the lighting and seeing the lighter dots. But I just let everyone know that Zoom tends to adjust for us sometimes, but it'll come together as we progress through the class.
Yes, thank you. I know that's always the trickiest part of making lighter marks on the page. Okay, here it is. Here's the page I was looking for before that shows you that full tonal value scale using the graphite from last week and tonal shading, which is smooth continuous shading. And that's the one value technique that we cannot use with pens because we can't get that smooth continuous action to happen. So I'm just going to zoom in on our reference image real quick and just show you the first general lines that you would use to get started to draw this. And we'll start with this other one because I've already done it. And I'm just going to go over my lines from last week and explain why starting this way would be helpful for you. Does that look dark on the screen? This is where it helps me. Like, can you see my drawing behind that? Should I put a piece of paper behind that? I realized that bothers me, but because of Zoom adjusting, that maybe is not showing up that way. Rich, can you see my
It's
drawing?
showing up. Yeah, it's showing up pretty clearly.
Okay, let me get a piece of paper underneath there. Hang on.
Okay. And while you're doing that, we have a quick question.
Okay.
Uh, I'm sorry, I just lost it. But the question was, let me find it here. Sorry, this chat is okay. From Becky. Becky's wondering, is it advisable to use different pins instead of using different pressures using one pin?
Yes, that's why I just went over all the different pen nib sizes and talked about the thickness of each one. So, and as I was creating that value scale, I switched between my pens frequently to accommodate the different values. So, yeah, you can use the 0.8 for your darker values and then use the 0.03 for your lightest value. So we can see there what the thick to thinness is on those different pens in that set. So yeah, definitely the pen size, the nib size can be used or the amount of pressure that you're putting on it. You could essentially complete this entire little study using one of your smaller nibs, like your 0.01 or your 0.03 or 0.05, etc. But you would just have to do a lot more layering to get it to be dark. You would have a harder time executing this whole thing with a thicker nib because it would be really hard to get those light dots to happen with that thickest nib. So you definitely want a couple of different nib sizes, but it is possible to complete this if you had a smaller nib, but not if you only had a bigger one. Okay, so just gonna grab a pencil here for this sketching part. Got a nice fat Artist Loft 4B here. I'm gonna use that. Okay, so last week we really zoomed in. I've been noticing some feedback that I've had lately in graphite classes, especially where people get frustrated because they can't see the lightest lines that I make when I'm first getting started. And I think that's where a lot of people tend to need help is just knowing which lines to start with. So I zoomed in on this image. We're going to be making a square. So I drew a nice big square. And if you want to go ahead and draw your smaller square and start sketching this inside of it with a light pencil that you can easily erase, because I forgot to mention pencils and erasers, but those are definitely recommended unless you want to work with pen only tonight and challenge yourself. You can draw with your pencil first, and then, like, I can still see my pencil lines on here from before. You want them nice and light so that you can easily erase those lines when you're done. Okay, so we started with circles. We're starting very general and then getting more specific. So we started with a big circle here for this big lollipop shape of the Caspedia flower. And then we noticed how all these other circles overlapped each other. So we have one big circle here, and I used a trick of using my fingers to measure how far down into the box it is before that circle starts, because you definitely want your shapes to be somewhat accurate to how you're seeing them in the photograph, because that's just going to help you execute this composition and this image with the light, and to be able to follow along with what I'm doing. And if you zoom in or zoom out too much, or if you overlap the Caspedia flowers, especially in a way that's drastically different than in the photograph, then you might run into issues, because we're really going to be using the negative space around the flowers to add all this value. So definitely helps to notice these little negative space moments and put those in as closely to how you're seeing them as possible. It'll just help the image make more sense, and you won't have to imagine it quite as much if you get it accurate. So we start with a big circle, and then we have 4 circles overlapping each other. Some of them we can see the whole thing, and then others we can only see part of it or a little sliver of it back there. And this one in front was a little bit more squashed down, like an oval shape here. So you're looking for more of an oval shape to start on this Caspedia flower in front. And then we noticed the overall shape of the shadows and light. So here we have little crescent moon shape. And if we zoom in on it, we talked about how the shapes within the shadows and light maybe look like little heart shapes or little island shapes or little circles. So I started out just drawing some heart shapes, because why not? We're going general and then getting more specific as we go. So whatever little shape you want to draw for those little bits of light that are creeping in. So noticing those, because even though it gets very dark within this shadow, we want there to be a lot of variation in that light. And we want to leave the paper blank where that light is going to go. So we want to plan ahead for some of those little circles of light. But we don't want them to all be perfect circles. So we want them to be a little bean shaped or maybe heart shaped, little island shapes, just to give yourself an indication that this is going to be left blank paper and the shadow is going to be going in between these shapes. And then overall, we have a big shape of a crescent shape of light happening here on the side of that Caspedia flower that's sticking out at the top there. And then for the outer edge of the flower, we talked about last week this heart rate monitor line that we can use to get this imperfect. Although on this side of it with the pen and ink, we're going to let this kind of fade away, and we're not going to have much of a mark here. But if you want to go ahead and draw it in pencil just to have a guide for yourself, that's fine. But anywhere the light is touching light, we're going to let our blank paper and our faded out stippling dots suggest that area of light for us. So the areas of light, we're leaving them blank, and the areas of dark is what we're focusing on with our pens. So right here on the side of the stalk, we've got a solid black. So we want that shape in there, but again, we don't want it to be a perfect line. And maybe you have a couple of little circles here on the side for where the shadow is a little wonky. And then it's pretty solid black right here. So this is where we're going to be stippling more to a solid 10. And then across this leaf, we might cheat a little bit and use maybe some hatching or cross hatching. Or yeah, probably cross hatching because it'll go the fastest. And we'll fill that leaf in unless you want to sit there and do a million dots to fill in that leaf. That's our biggest area of solid 10 black that we have in this image. Okay, and then same thing on overlapping these. We're not going to go all the way to a dark black on this Caspedia, but it is pretty dark. So maybe you just do your little heart rate monitor shape here and then draw a few circles all over for where you're seeing that light coming in. And then there's one area right here where this Caspedia in front overlaps where it's going to get really dark. So that dark that we're going to put in right there is what's really going to push this light forward. So we always need darkness in order to make the light stand out. And a little metaphorical for us here. And then I joked last week about how this rose is not a main character in this drawing. It's more of a supporting character, and we're just going to imply this rose. We're not even going to really worry about even making it look like a rose. We're just going to notice the shapes of value that we're seeing. So some of these lines and shapes and maybe a little sticky outy moment up here, but we're just giving the general idea of the shadows that we're seeing for that rose. And we're just gonna stipple those shadows in and not even worry about if it distinctly looks like a rose or not, because we're really focused more on these Caspedia flowers in this one. Okay, and I'm aware of the time, but I want to help us get started with our drawings. So let me do this one more time with this other image. I'm going to zoom in and just outline the general lines that you would start with to get started drawing this, because my lines might be too light for you to see on the page. So I'm going to start with a big square. If you want to go ahead and sketch this in your smaller square, I'm only drawing this big for you all to see my lines nice and big. Okay, so now we're looking at this reference image of the rose, and I've had an entire class on drawing roses. It was called Flower Fundamentals, drawing roses. I've also done that with orchids, datura flowers, a number of flower fundamental classes that I've done for Michael's. You can check those out in that playlist that Rich shared with you, or if you're watching later on YouTube, you can search my name and flower fundamentals and find all those classes. So I'm not going to go into detail on how to draw this rose. We're really just going to focus on these light shapes and the very general two specific shapes that we're looking for. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit because I cut it off in the study over here on the side. So we're really zooming in and focused on this negative space shape right here is what we really want to get as accurate as possible, because that's where all our pen is going to mostly go. And then here in this, the shadow, etc. But to get started with our general shapes, we're going to look at the negative space, and we're not going to draw just like a big cereal. Well, you could actually just draw a big cereal bowl shape, like a big bucket shape like this, or maybe an egg. Let's call it an egg coming off the side there. And then, oh, do you have is there a question?
Deb's just wondering, are you going to be stippling with the pen over the top of the pencil sketching?
Yes, I'm just zooming in right now and helping you get started. So you know where to put your pencil lines so that you can sketch it, because oftentimes it seems like people need help just getting started. And when I draw with my pencil light and small, then you can't see it on the screen. So I'm just still doing preliminary sketching here, but we're about to get going with the pens as soon as possible. Okay, so we're starting with a big egg shape and you want that going half off of your little, or not half off. It's about 2/3 of it that's showing. And really looking at the negative space up here to get a little more exact and notice some of those petals that are sticking out and creating some different shapes coming off of it, like that, maybe like a little wing. And then we've got a big little half circle right there. And then another overlapping half circle like that. And then a little crescent moon shape that's not a perfect crescent moon shape like that. I'm just looking at the value shapes, the shapes of shadows and the shapes of light. They don't need to be 100% accurate. We want it to look like a rose. It doesn't have to look like this particular rose. And this may help you to draw a little spiral here in the center or kind of off to the side going off the edge. That might help you to be general and then get more specific, but I'm just going to look at the shapes again. I'm just looking at, because I think if I follow that spiral too much I might get tripped up, but that might help you. And I am just looking at these little triangular shapes that overlap each other. Just looking at the shapes of the shadows and the shapes of the light. So it's a lot of wonky little crescent moon shapes and triangular shapes, little half circle shapes. They don't all have to be in there. Once you start to feel like it's giving you the effect of a rose, that's good enough. We don't need perfection. We just want good enough here. And then we've got this very elegant petal hanging off, draping down here. So again, just looking at the shadowy shapes that we're seeing underneath. We don't need too much there. And then we'll get a big circle for this first Caspedia, but it is being eclipsed by the rose. And really using the negative space here. So I noticed there's this little triangular shape of darkness here underneath that petal that sticks out like a little ribbon. So I'm going to go underneath that ribbon shaped petal and I'll draw my circle that is mostly eclipsed. And it's going to feel smaller. It maybe is a little bigger in the picture, but I drew it smaller like that there. So I'm going to leave it that size. And then I can see another little cereal bowl or bucket shape for this other rose, or actually, yeah, it's another rose back there. But again, these are just supporting characters. We don't need a lot of detail on them. Just noticing some of those value shapes on that background rose. Mostly we're trying to focus on where is the dark gonna go and where is the light gonna go. So we want the silhouette shape. And if you need to start with a cereal bowl because it's too hard for you to look for these more specific shapes, start with a cereal bowl, little cereal bowl shape for those roses, and then get more specific and look for those irregular, more organic shapes that are happening. And you definitely don't want to draw as dark as I am here. You want to draw nice and light. You can easily erase your lines unless you're doing a practice sketch with me. And then we've got another circle back there. Another Caspedia flower. But mostly we're looking at this negative space around it. We want to make sure that all matches up. So a little heart rate monitor to get that outer area and noticing this silhouette of light, because this is what we're going to fill in with our stippling. All of this darkness And all of this darkness is going to push the light forward. So it's a lot of blank paper. And that is on purpose so that we won't have to draw quite as much with our pens to make the magic happen here. And then we have a stem that is very faint. That's going to end up getting covered up with quite a bit of stippling and some of these little leaves back here. So just looking again for that silhouette shape. And then all of this is going to be, we're going to really build up our stippling in these areas. And we've got another big crescent shape of shadow on here. And we can look for our little island shapes or our little bean shapes of light that are hitting this. And again, up here on this one will be a lot of faint stippling. So it'll show up lighter in the background. Okay, so these are the lines that you might use to get started if you need, some groundwork in your sketch. And I wanted to make sure everybody felt supported in how to get started with their drawing. Okay, so now I'm going to get started with mine. I'm going to use my Post-it note there. And then I'm using a very light H pencil. So you're not going to be able to see my lines on the screen. That's why I just did the other thing, zooming in for you. I'm just going to line this up. I feel like I'm always crediting my friend who shared this trick with me, but got to give credit where credit is due. My good friend Jenny Granberry, who you can find on YouTube, has a number of awesome drawing and painting classes, and I learned this trick from her to outline a Post-it note or a business card. I use a playing card a lot to do this and get a nice frame on the page so we can have some very intentional thumbnails going. Okay, and then I'm just going to quickly, lightly sketch my foundational lines. And I don't really need as many details as specific as I went on that last one. I'm really just making sure I have the general idea of where the negative space is going. So don't expect you to see these lines that I'm drawing right now because I just took the time to draw them nice and big for you. But this is why you want to draw light, because you might not get everything exactly where you want it the first time, and then you can erase and move things around. I'm just looking to see that I gave myself the same amount of negative space to fill in. And it's okay if the shapes are a little different and it doesn't look exactly like these particular flowers. That's why flowers are such a good go-to reference, because they are so organic. And unless you got somebody there holding up your photograph next to your drawing and telling you you didn't get it exactly right, nobody's going to notice. And if anybody does do that to your drawing, don't be friends with that person. And if it's a family member or a husband or a partner, it's always the husband. Well, that doesn't look exactly like that. Rose, you just tell them it doesn't matter. Nobody cares. It's a rose. A rose is a rose. It looks like a rose. That's all that matters.
Deb says, what if it's your sister?
Oh, same thing. Tell her it doesn't matter. Leave me alone. Worry about yourself. That's my favorite line from a video of a couple of kids arguing with each other, right? I think the kid saying, worry about yourself.
I think that's my mom's favorite line with me these days.
Oh, yeah.
Worry about yourself.
I was on a walk with my mom in her neighborhood the other day, and every person that passes us on the street, she has to talk to them and get in their business. And I'm like, wow, when I go for a walk in my neighborhood, I just walk past people. I might wave, but you were like, who is that? Do I know them? I need to know everything about them. She needs to worry about herself a little more. Okay, that's good for that one. I'm gonna go ahead and sketch this other one too. Hopefully nobody's concerned about time because I strategically picked, I'm a little worried about it, but tried to pick images that really have a lot of strong contrasting light here to make it easier for us to execute. And I mentioned this last week in the class that that is a good tip for any beginners out there when you're creating reference images for yourself to work from. Try to use images that have very high contrast, or you can turn up the contrast on the image, make the darks darker, make the lights lighter. The more dramatic, the easier it's going to be to see these shapes.
Adrian, Emma's wondering, does it matter? Does the type of paper have an impact on your stippling or in this particular project?
Yes, this illustration paper, Bristol paper, vellum paper, or marker paper, it's all just going to absorb the pen a little differently. It just elevates it slightly. It's fine if you're working on regular drawing paper. It's not that your drawing's not going to be as successful or anything like that, but paper type definitely matters, and it
And
can
then
make it.
we have another quick question about the negative space. Could you explain a little bit more what you mean by that? Do you mean that you outline the dark areas or the shadows?
Yeah, so let me go back with this example again real quick and just point out, since it's hard to see in my drawing right now. Oh, where to go? So because we are using the dark areas to, and the both the dark and the light to make this image pop, if you were to leave out like this little keyhole space of negative space, then you're not going to have that little area of light, which is not a big deal. Like I did accidentally leave it out in this one. You can't see it there, but it makes a difference in this one, having that little space of light. So if you just lump everything together and you don't pay attention to these areas of dark and light, you're going to miss opportunities to create a more dramatic composition, because we really need all of the light space to make the we need all of the dark to make the light stand out, and vice versa. So it's important to just take note of this negative space. Also, that's mostly what we're going to be drawing in, especially tonight, is the negative space around the flower. We're going to add more stippling behind this rose than we are to the actual rose. So if you don't have that negative space, the rose might not stand out in the same way. So you definitely want to have some blank paper here between the edge of your frame and the rows so that you can stipple in that darkness to make it come forward, make the rows come forward. There are certain things that when we draw, we're not really drawing the thing quite as much as the space behind the thing. And that's when the thing is very light. Unless you're using white paint or white chalk pastel on toned paper, that sort of situation. But when you're using blank paper as your white space, you definitely need an awareness of the background, because that's what you're going to spend more time drawing, is the background. So tonight we're going to spend more time drawing the backgrounds here than we are, especially in this one, than we are the actual flowers. And likewise, like this Caspedia flower that's overlapping right here, if I got that negative space wrong, it could throw me off while I'm drawing, and I could easily get lost. So it's also helpful for you to not get confused when you're drawing. And it's going to make for a better composition. Okay, so I got my basic shapes all mapped out here, and I'm just going to take the top of my eraser, or take the side of my eraser, and take the top layer off of my graphite. Just don't need my drawing to be very dark. And let's start with the darkness, since I'm talking about all this, so I can start to illuminate why the negative space is so important. And we'll start with this one down here because it's going to take longer. So with the one on the bottom. And I'm starting with my fattest nib. That was the 0.8. And I'm going into this negative space here. And I'm starting to stipple in until I get to a solid black. And already right there, I didn't draw it exactly like in the photograph, so I have a little less space to fill in right there, but it gets to pretty solid black in this space in the background here in this negative space. So we can just keep adding our dots. We're trying to get a solid black to happen here. And actually, before we get too far with that, let's take one of our smaller nib pens just to plan ahead for anybody who is faster than me. Let's kind of draw our little heart rate monitor edge of that Caspedia flower so that we don't make this too perfect on the edge here. Well, that one is drying up. I gotta find a different 005. Hang on. And it's okay if you already did fill it in kind of a little too perfect. We just want, a little bit of an uneven edge right there. And then maybe if you want to go ahead and trace the outer edge of your rows here as well. Just keep it nice and soft and organic so you know where you are.
So we got a couple of questions coming through.
Okay.
If you can't draw a stick figure, would you suggest using a thin paper and practice on a printout of a picture, if that makes sense?
Uh oh, like would I advise just tracing it? Yeah, you could trace it if your overall goal is just to have a product that you're happy with. Otherwise nobody wants to hear this, but yeah, just lots of practice. Starting really general and then getting more specific as we go. So I mean, all I drew to get started here, and I don't even have any more than this on my paper, I started with a circle and heart shapes and crescent shapes. I tried to make it as simple, and I know it still feels more complicated, but just take it slow. Start with your circle, overlap your circles. No need to rush ahead. There will be a recording of the class on YouTube tomorrow too, or you could go back and check out last week's class where we also drew the same image and practice. Just the more you practice, the easier things get. Uh, but just start with those simple shapes because you'll be amazed how this is going to truly develop really slowly, just drawing one dot at a time. So another thing that really helps me is to not think about the fact that I'm drawing a rose, but to call it something else. So I called it a cereal bowl, right? Or a bucket. And then I drew the little cinnamon roll spiral inside of it. If that helps you to just get that basic idea of a rose going to get started here, we're going to go step by step through adding all these shadows. So just keep it simple and trust the process. I don't have an intricately drawn rose yet. All I have is the outer shape and a few little crescent shapes sketched inside of there so far. And then I'm just building up these dots on the outer edge. So if you can draw a dot, one dot at a time, and a cereal bowl and a circle, you can do this. This is pretty tedious and repetitive. Just building up those dots, and I realized I switched to a smaller nib and then never went back. Let me get that fatter one going. The fatter nib's definitely gonna get those dots a little faster, but I'll admit I really do prefer to use a smaller nib the whole time because I just think it looks more elegant that way to have lots of tiny little dots. I can tell I used my smaller nib over here. And what I do when I'm drawing is I put on a TV show that I can half pay attention to, and I get my pens and my sketchbooks, and I get my little lap desk going on the couch and just draw for hours and hours. So sometimes I try not to go over an hour and a half when I'm planning one particular class, but just because I enjoy drawing with a smaller nib, I can tell that's what I did there. And it definitely has a very elegant effect. And I feel like the fatter dots, they just don't quite have that same effect for me. But how are we doing on time? Oh my goodness, it's already 7 o'clock. Yikes. Okay. So yeah, let me stick to my fatter nib here. This might have to be one of those classes where I switch to my more completed drawing at a certain point for us, but I'll make sure I hit all of the big notes. We've had a lot of great questions tonight, but they have maybe slowed me down a little more. And this is just a slow process. It's hard not to be slow and patient with it. As much as I tried to simplify it for us. Okay, so I'm going around this stem and just filling in. I'm going straight for the drama, going straight for the darkest areas because that's what's going to take the most time. And I am just going to keep an eye on the clock, and every 5 minutes, I'm going to jump to a different part of the drawing, and I think we'll get farther than you might expect. Because again, there's a lot of light. There's a lot of blank paper in these images. So just filling in those shapes in the dark background right now with solid dots.
Question about holding your pen. Do you hold your nib at an angle to the paper or a right angle?
That's a good question. It's really what's the most comfortable for you, without putting, I think certain pens, they don't, like if I go in from the side, which I'm always recommending, sometimes the ink doesn't come out of it. So you really do have to point down at the top of the nib. But if you're really heavy handed and you feel yourself just smashing into it, too much, then try to go more at an angle. Yeah, it's really just about the pressure. You don't want to stab it so much into the paper that you're pushing the nib out of or into the pen, because then you can't use it anymore. But you can see how this is really starting to create this dramatic effect just by looking at the background space here. And it definitely gets darker a lot more in this photo, but we're just going to fade it out again to save time, but you can keep going. If you really have the patience and the time and you want this to be as beautifully elegant as possible, I would use your smaller nib, like a 0.3. That was my favorite one that I had a minute ago, but I felt like I was going to take too long if I kept using that one, but I love how that looks. And then just really take your time and build up and maybe let this solid dark spread out a little more so than I did, because it is pretty dark in this photo all the way over to the edge here, but I let the light dominate a little more. Okay, and then for these little silhouetted moments, we can go ahead and draw these little leaves that stick out, little pointy leaves, and then we'll fill those in with dots. Got this dark leaf over here. We'll fill that in with dots. And I'm going to jump back up here, and I still have not gotten this little silhouette moment to happen yet. I use my smaller nib pen and draw that edge that I'm looking for. Just drawing a very, sorry about that. Sometimes my computer just suddenly gives me a message that someone sent me earlier in the day. Okay, and then I am going to stick with my 0.3 nib here because I want to be a little more precise along these edges, and that 0.8 just, maybe it's a preference thing. If you feel like you can get it in there without it being too fat, it's just a little too thick for me to control it the way I want to. So that's probably why I prefer to draw more dots with a smaller nib, because I will have more control that way. And I'm sure a lot of you will relate to that if you've practiced this method for any duration of time. You'll start to notice your own preferences with it. And then just a little conversation about patience when it comes to this. I'll admit, when I first learned how to draw realistically, which was exactly 20 years ago, and I took my first drawing one class at Austin Community College and had a wonderful teacher named Judith Simons, who's still a good friend of mine. And she taught me all these shading techniques and all the essentials of drawing. We talked about the book Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain with Betty Edwards, which I love and highly recommend. And the first successful drawing I ever did where it looked like thing I was trying to draw, I was using stippling and graphite pencils. And I stepped back and was like, holy smokes, it looks like you could just, it was like a little organic nature item. And I felt like I could just pluck it off of the page. It looked so realistic. And I had never drawn anything realistic like that before. And so stippling really became my favorite tool in my toolbox because as long as I was patient, I could really draw anything because it's just one dot at a time. So if I'm just willing to put in the time and effort and patience with it, it's eventually going to develop, like I was saying a minute ago. But I will admit, as I've gotten further into my career and draw all the time, and I know I've got lots of tools in my tool belt, stippling is not a crutch that I lean on very often as much as I maybe should because sometimes I don't have time for that. Let me just get this done. Okay, so bouncing over here to this big crescent shadow, I'm gonna just kind of create that shadow very loosely with a bunch of dots to signal to myself, here's where the shadow is going. And then if you need to draw a few little circles in there so that you keep, or little half circles so that you keep some blank paper in there, and then just start filling in your dots in between. And I'm still on this 0.3 nib because that's just apparently my favorite one. But you use whatever nib makes sense to you. If you feel like you're really having a hard time controlling what's happening with these dots, then go even smaller with your nib. Use your 0.05 or 0.03 so that every dot that you make is really faint and you can be really generous and gentle with yourself as you build these up. And then start to get in here on some of these shadows on the, but as I say that, I am going to switch to a smaller nib for these really faint shadows inside of the rows, just to build my confidence a little bit here, because sometimes it can be scary when you're working on something that's so light, because this value is really light on this rose. So you need to start out super light in those shadows and then move up to a thicker nib once you've established those shadow shapes and you feel a little more confident and comfortable. And again, don't worry about it looking identical to that rose. Just trust the process and fill in these shadows, and eventually it's gonna get there. I'm looking at where these two petals overlap and they create a shadow here. I want the light of that petal in front to come forward. So I really need to concentrate on this shadow next to it, next to the light. That's how we make the light come forward, is by having that shadow next to it. We're going to be talking about that a lot next month because we've got a couple of classes on drawing drapery in graphite and pen and ink. And drapery is very tricky because it is just pure value. There's not necessarily, I mean, there is a structure to the drapery, but it's not a intuitive structure. So you really have to rely on these shadow shapes a lot. And you're always going to have an area of darkness near the light. You just are. You're not going to see that light unless there's some darkness nearby, right? Or else it's just all light. So I've got to have a shadow to make the light come forward. I'm just bouncing around inside of these little crescent moon shaped shadows that we sketched. And I'm starting to fill those in. And as long as they are creating overall a little bit of a spiral, it's going to start to feel like a rose there.
Not sure if you answered this already yet, but any ideas for subjects to stipple for beginners to practice?
Honestly, I think one of these Caspedia flowers is pretty simple. It's a sphere. And in my class that I'm always referencing for beginners, I think it's called Graphite Basics for Beginners. It's in that playlist. I go through all of the different shading techniques and how to draw a sphere using each of the shading techniques. So you could check that class out, and I do a sphere, turning a circle into a sphere using hatching, cross hatching, stippling, and scribbling. And that would be a great thing to start with. That's what I do in a beginning drawing class with, in a 6-week long in-person drawing class. I teach everybody these shading techniques. We do all the different value scales, and then we do a handful of circles and try to make them look like spheres. Easier said than done, but really good practice for beginners to start to see how to apply the shading techniques to a shape and turn it into a 3-dimensional form. All about the light. The light is telling you everything you need to know. So yeah, start really basic with just a sphere. It doesn't even have to be a sphere you're observing. It can be in a sphere from your imagination, or copying a picture of a sphere with a single light source. Okay. This one is starting to develop, but we still need, let's see, how are we doing on time? Oh my goodness. Okay, so I'm jumping up here to this Caspedia in the background and adding in those dots to create that overall crescent moon shape, and then starting to fill them in between. And then for an area like this, where it's overall very dark, but we can still see this stem. So I filled in the background around the stem to almost a solid black here. And then I'm just going to go inside of it and try to get a nice mid-tone value all the way across the stem, because it's still in shadow in the image, but you can see it. So you can faintly see it. So we don't want it to stand out. If we leave it blank paper, that's telling the audience that that's an absolute light area, and it's not. It's in shadow, but there's still some light hitting it. So make it dark around it first, and then add a shadow on top of it until you're satisfied with how it looks. Stepping back, and it's good to step back away from this every once in a while, especially with this, because you can really get sucked in to the point where you're just staring at it so long, starts to not make sense to you. So the more you step back and look at it from a distance, the more you'll start to see, hey, it's starting to look like the thing. Okay, and then this rose here in the background is actually it's a lot of blank paper. We really just need this shadow on this Caspedia here in the front to be darker, and the one in the back. And then we need a lot more dots in this background, but I want to move on to the other one too. I definitely overestimated my ability to film. I'm like, don't worry about the time. We'll be able to finish these. Well, let me jump up here to this other one and then I can just touch on any questions that you may have. Okay, so let's start with, I definitely want to tell you about that vignette there. So let's go straight for the drama on this one and go ahead and fill in that solid black. And I'm going to cheat a little bit here and do a solid hatching and cross hatching line within that shape of that leaf. So I'll draw my little leaf shape and then I'm just filling that in. If you have the patience to do it with stippling, it will definitely show that patience and elegance in taking your time to do it that way. But I just want to get it done and make it stand out. So I'm using a diagonal hatching line across it and then going back over that again with another diagonal hatching line. Cross hatching and scribbling are the two shading techniques that go the fastest. And in that beginning class that I mentioned a moment ago, I draw a sphere with all five of them: tonal, shading, hatching, cross hatching, stippling, and scribbling. Or random mark. Scribbling can be any random mark that feels like possibly a scribble. Okay. And then we'll jump to, yeah, let's do the stem. All the areas that are going to make this pop really quickly. So see, having that little keyhole space of light right there makes a difference. And then there was this moment here at the edge of this Cascadia flower where the light hits the edge here. So we need darkness next to it. I'm not going to keep the heart rate monitor line going all the way around because this is going to fade out here into the blank paper. So I'm just going to draw it right there to give myself that edge. And then I'm going to really push this shadow along that edge right there to make the light come forward. So just starting in those darkest shadowy moments are just going to create that drama that we're looking for, this high contrast between dark and light. I feel like I'm overusing the word drama, but it feels very appropriate because it's like, yeah, if you're saying a person is really dramatic or a movie is really dramatic, it probably has a lot of highs and lows, right? It's not just a sad movie, not just a happy movie. It's very dramatic. It's all the things. And definitely don't compare my drawing to yours, because I did just mention how I've been stippling for 20 years, and we've clearly got some people who've never stippled before in the class. Just be patient with yourself. This definitely gets easier with practice, and it takes a lot of time. It's extremely time consuming. Oh my goodness. Speaking of the time, Okay, so this might be one of those classes, yeah, where I'm about to just jump to my final drawing over here and point out how I did, or my more completed drawing over here and point out how I did things and explain them. And then y'all please ask any questions of anything that I didn't get a chance to explicitly explain, and I can take a moment to talk about how to complete that area of the drawing. But mainly it's very repetitive. We've already done it on, well, I don't know that we've finished one Caspedia yet here, but the more you keep building up your dots, eventually you're going to get that big shadowy area to stand out. So that's what you're looking for, is that big crescent shadowy shape. And it just takes time to build up those dots. I wouldn't recommend drawing that heart rate monitor thing on the outside of these, because then if your dots don't all fill that in, you want to let your dots create that. So you kind of go up to the edge and let that shape happen. That outer edge be uneven. And then don't fix it too much so that it'll read as uneven to the viewer. And then you want to just leave it open here where the light's hitting it. You don't want to draw anything at all. You want to switch to your smallest nib for this really light area and just let it fade out. So this was the stuff that was hard to see at the beginning of the class. You can see it now in this drawing because it's next to all of this darkness, right? But by itself, it feels extremely faint, but you want it to be really faint. And you don't want a hard edge. You want that to just disappear. So what you really need is the shadow of this Caspedia flower right here in the background, the one that's being overlapped by the other three. You need that one to get as dark as it is in the image, which is pretty dark, almost solid black in some places. You want to push that one, and then that's going to push the edge of the one in front of it forward just by having this one so dark in the background. So once again, we're using that background darkness to push the light forward. And you want to maintain some of these little circles if you need to draw them so that you don't cover them up, and then go in between them. Start to fill in that big shadow. And then for the vignette in the background here, definitely use your smallest nib, like your 0.03 or your 0.05. And it's going to start out really faint, and it's going to take a lot of little dots to start to create this little triangle shape. So if you want to just start out, I know it's really hard to see this on the screen, but I'm just creating a triangle shape with my dots, and then just filling that in. And it's going to be the darkest in the corner. So the most concentrated, the most overlapping of dots in the corner. And then they're going to slowly spread out. And then the blank paper just does the rest of the work for you. You just fade it out, taper it out into the blank paper. You can maybe do a few dots that go down the center of the sides here. And a vignette is tricky with a lot of different mediums, and I'm a big fan of putting a vignette in a drawing and painting, and I've done it a lot throughout these classes for Michael's. We did it with acrylic paint a couple of times. We've done it with, I feel like we did it with watercolor recently, but maybe I'm getting it mixed up with another class I taught recently. But anyway, we did it last week with the graphite too, and it's tricky. You gotta take your time and be really light with your pressure. But this is probably the easiest vignette to do. Again, you just need patience because just one dot at a time, and then you're just fading it out. But this will definitely take a lot of time to create that vignette. And then back here on this rose, we're not worried about making that look exactly like that rose. We're just filling in those shadows as we see them. And it might not even look like anything distinct when we're done, but it's just a supporting character. So we don't need it to have a whole lot of depth, right? Using the movie analogy a lot tonight. Okay. I feel like I at least touched on how to get to here, even though I know we didn't quite get there. But I'd love to see y'all's drawings and how far you made it with stippling these flowers. And then if you have any questions that I could spend a moment, maybe we could go a minute over here and I could help fill in any gaps that you have. I'm happy to do that.
I'm looking through now. I don't see any yet. Here we have one.
All right, so Cheryl. Oh, yes, Cheryl. Wow. Yeah, look at all that drama with all those. Ooh, and you did dots the whole time. Beautiful. Yeah, the other thing I think is so nice about the dots is sometimes with the other shading techniques, the streakiness of the pen. Oh, Autumn, look at that. Oh my gosh, Autumn, I love it. But yeah, the streakiness of a pen can kind of get in the way, but with this, it just looks so elegant. Oh, I love how you even curved your hatching lines on your leaf there. It looks so dynamic. It's beautiful. Feels like it's breathing. Oh, that's beautiful, Lois. Yes. Really feeling those, like that vignette as it got started there. Okay, this is Swanche. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but beautiful stippling, just gorgeous. I love how those edges of those Caspedia flowers are just nice and implied. And you got that vignette going a little bit there. Really nice. Shannon. Oh yeah, really feeling that spiral on the rose. Ooh, that has such a whimsical feeling to it. See, if we don't get the proportions exactly like in the photograph, then it just takes on a stylistic quality. It feels like those flowers are dancing together. This is Barbara. Hi, Barbara. That looks so good. Yeah, see that shadow you've got on the side of that Caspedia on top is just pushing that one in front forward so much. Here's Emma. Oh, your background is blurring it. That when you have the blurry background, it never wants to focus on anything but your face. Okay, I see it now a little bit. Okay, yeah, just keep building up those values and yeah, that's coming along. That's really nice. That's got a nice stylistic quality to it. Gloria, we got you spotlighted. You want to hold up your drawing or did you have it up and then put it down? Thank you for that feedback, Shannon. Enjoyed having you. Oh, yeah, look at that dramatic effect. Oh, yeah, you really went for it in the spaces in between those rose petals, and that has a really nice stylistic quality to it as well. Oh, and I love how slowly you're going with those Caspedias on top, too. Says Patricia. All right, using graphite, but still stippling. Don't have to use pens. And that looks lovely. And you can combine them. That's always a question I get in classes. Is can you combine the shading techniques? And you definitely can. That's lovely. All right, this is Basima. Beautiful. Look at that Caspedia in front. Yeah, that's got a really nice stylistic quality to it as well. Oh, Deb, I love it. Look how, oh, you're going so delicately with that rose and holy moly, those Caspedias on top. And I remember you blew me away last week with your graphite drawings too. I have not forgotten. Gorgeous. Sandra, that's beautiful as well. That's nice and clear too. Showing up so nicely. How do you get your graphite to show up that well on your screen? That's really nice. Pushing those backgrounds. All right, y'all. Thank you so much. That is always the highlight of my day, is seeing your drawings at the end of the class. And next week we'll be using the gouache, the Artist Loft Jelly Gouache, which is a lot of fun, or any opaque watercolor that you have. And I really love that Artist Loft Jelly Gouache. If you haven't picked it up, I even got a new set recently. So excited to do a little monochromatic study with the gouache next week. Make sure you sign up for that class, and I'll see you then. And oh, thank you, Deb. Love all the kind words y'all are